Hi, this is Glenn Loury. This clip is taken from a conversation I recently posted at my Patreon page. The full episode will be available for free in a few days, but if you want to see it now and support the show, please go to patreon.com/Glenn Show. That's patreon.com/Glenn Show. Thanks.
Now, this is the big question that the intellectual historian loves asking. What was the dissertation? Why did you choose it? And how did it shape the next 50 years of your life?
We've only got 15 minutes. Okay. So my dissertation was called Essays in the Theory of the Distribution of Income, and there were two papers. I had written other papers in graduate school that ended up getting published, but they were on other topics, and I kept them out of my dissertation. The model of a set of essays, which were 2 or 3 or 4 pieces of work that could be submitted to a journal and that taken together constituted the dissertation, was well established in economics at that time. So it was not a sustained argument on one question. It was a set of investigations of related questions. In my case, there were 2 essays on the theory of the distribution of income. One was called Intergenerational Transfers and the Distribution of Income. And it was not about race, it was about inequality, and it was about the fact that developing young people depend in part upon resources transferred to them by their parent, not only bequest, financial resources, but human developmental resources, the investments in the quality of their education and the experiences that abet their acquisition of skill, which would not be equalized across families because families were not equally placed in the distribution themselves. And rich parents were always going to be better able to provide their kids with resources than would poor families be able to do, even though the kid in a rich family might not be more talented than the kid in a poor family. And the idea that the diminishing returns idea, basic economic idea that you get less for each additional unit of the input, you get less output, suggested that wealthy parents were probably, from an economic point of view, over-investing in their children relative to poor parents, in the sense that if a unit of investment in the wealthy parent's kid could be transferred to the poor kid, the loss from the wealthy parent, because of diminishing returns, kid would be less than the gain from the poor kid. You would expect capital markets to solve this problem, where there's an investment opportunity here, enhance the future productivity of a kid who's in a poor family by making resources available now, and you'll get a higher return on that than you would by putting those same resources into your own kid who already has got so much being invested in him, the marginal return is less. There ought to be a market to allow that transaction to take place, but that market wouldn't exist. These were the early days of the field of information economics, adverse selection, and so on. That market wouldn't exist because of obvious contract problems. You can't enforce the contracts that require the kid of a parent to repay a loan undertaken on their behalf. And there's also incentive problems because income insurance and things like that. So there's an economic resource allocation problem of a first order implied by the fact that human development depends upon family-specific resource transfers that are constrained by the availability of money to the parent. Inequality today is related to inequality in the next generation via this mechanism. I found a way of taking the theory of stochastic economic growth, which I won't try to describe, but it's basically a dynamic formalization of the optimal accumulation of capital under conditions of uncertainty, and applying it to this situation where parents in the current generation would be uncertain about how gifted their children would be, but would nevertheless have to make investment decisions in their children. And I used that framework to study the movement from one generation to the next of the distribution of income. Now, my point here was to basically highlight the distinction between the dynamic process of mobility from one generation to the next and the static outcome of a steady state of inequality. The dynamic process would eventually converge, I proved, to a steady state, but policy intervention that affected the dynamic process might have unexpected consequences for the steady state. And I wanted to make the point in this essays in the theory of the distribution of income as the thesis, Intergenerational Transfers and the Distribution of Income is the paper that I'm describing. I wanted to make the point that the classical trade-off between equity and efficiency falls apart in the world that I'm describing. That classical trade-off says you may not like there being so much inequality, but if you try to do anything about it, you're going to reduce the size of the pie because you're going to have to use instruments of intervention like taxation that distort the prices and cause there to be a wedge between price on one side or the other of the market. In the labor market, the return to the worker is less than the value to the employer by the amount of the wedge, which is the tax on the worker's wage. You're going to tax. Arthur Oken, the great late economist Arthur Oken, called it the leaky bucket. I'm trying to move the water from the well, which has a lot of water in it, to the well that has very little. But as I go across the field with my bucket, some of the water leaks out. That's the efficiency cost of redistribution. And the classic paradigm in thinking about economic redistribution involves a trade-off between equity and efficiency. But I was trying to make the point that that trade-off doesn't necessarily apply once you take into account the market imperfections that inhibit the ability of resources to be transferred from rich to poor families to facilitate the development of the children in poor families. So that was that paper. It was published
let me quickly clarify. So that's a argument in favor of some form of redistribution.
Yes. It's an argument very much in favor of some form of redistribution, and I go through in the applied part of this theoretical paper a number of different policies that are shown to, redistributive policies, that are shown to both increase the size of the pie and reduce the inequality of the steady state distribution of income, thereby illustrating my point that they're not necessarily in conflict in a world without perfect markets. So that was one paper. But the other paper, and I wanted to say it was published in 1981 in Econometrica, so that was a great paper. It's still cited. It's got maybe 2,000 citations.
Wow.
The other paper in my dissertation was called A Dynamic Theory of Racial Income Differences. And there it was also the same kind of formalism, although the particular math was a little different. I wasn't using, continuous state, discrete time, Markov chain type analysis. I had simplified the problem. But the question that I was asking was, suppose you have a history of discrimination against a racial group, and miracle of all miracles, it comes to an end. The discrimination comes to an end and the society reforms itself and it stops discriminating. So discrimination is you don't pay the worker what they're worth because of the worker's race. You pay blacks less. So blacks have less. They have less assets. They have less resource development and so forth. So they're poor. Their occupational profile looks less attractive. They're poor. They're poorer. So they start behind. If you have a nice structure with nice, smooth, diminishing returns and everything's nice and convex and everything, where you might expect convergence, right? If two countries start behind, but they have the same technology that's available, eventually, it might take a while, you would expect convergence. This is another implication of diminishing returns. The poorer countries with lower capital stocks are going to have a higher rate of return on capital than the rich countries. Money should move over the long term from rich to poor. They should converge asymptotically. What about groups? Will the blacks catch up if you stop discriminating against them, given that the world is nice in terms of the technological possibilities? And I said, well, let's distinguish between a world in which everything that is relevant to productivity is tradable. So everything that's relevant to productivity, I mean now the development of productive worker. So I mean education, I mean home influence, I mean nutrition, I mean a lot of stuff. But it's all available to be purchased on the market at the common prices because there's no discrimination. And I show in my model that yes, the group that's behind will catch up if everything's that's important to human development is tradable. But I said, however, let's consider a world in which some of the resources that influence human development are not tradable, that they get available, they become available to people only because of their social connections. So the influence of peer groups. I live in a neighborhood. There are other people like me and live in that neighborhood. They have things they like to do, things that they think are great. They have aspirations, dreams, hopes. They have heroes. They have villains. They have values. They have a culture particular to this network of association of individuals. That's not tradable, at least not in any easily imaginable way. Suppose non-traded factors that enhance individual productivity are important, and suppose they tend to be communicated between individuals based on social connectivity, and suppose social connectivity is not free of racial bias, even though economic activity is free of racial bias. Should I still expect convergence? Well, no. The answer I say is no.
Right.
And the conclusion I draw from this analysis is that equal opportunity will not be enough. That is, stopping discrimination as long in the economic sphere will not be enough to generate equality, even asymptotically, even in the very, very longest of run, so long as social connectivity continues to be influenced by race, and so long as social connectivity is important in terms of the external effects that go on within social networks to accounting for individual acquisition of skill. So equal opportunity. So this made me an advocate of affirmative action. And I was an advocate of affirmative action coming out of my dissertation. Laissez-faire cannot be relied upon to ensure, even in a world where legal discrimination has been eliminated, that the consequences of historical discrimination would attenuate and asymptotically go down to zero. Those consequences could stay around forever if social segregation was important, even if economic discrimination was ended. Now, the reason I thought that this was important was because social segregation, unlike economic discrimination, is difficult to fully regulate by government fiat. I can tell an employer that if I catch you not paying what this worker is worth, you're going to court and it's going to cost you plenty. And the employer will have an incentive to not discriminate. But I can't really tell people who to marry. I can't tell them whether or not to stay in the neighborhood or to move away. I can't tell them whom to befriend, whom to invite to their dinner parties, whom to go into business with. I can't, without violating the autonomy of individuals, which is an essential prerequisite to a free society, I can't fully control as a regulator the social connectivity of people. There's a limit beyond which one won't go, because to go beyond that limit is to have a one-child policy, like in China, or to move people around en masse so as to create ideal communities of a demographic composition of the planner's desire, which
or
might
busing.
Well, yeah. Busing. So busing is in that space, and you saw what happened with busing.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, it's also when you're writing this, and were you influeed by the culture of poverty debates at all?
Not much, a little bit, and I was definitely a lefty on the culture. The Moynihan Banfield culture, that was my sneering sentence. We do not here entertain the Moynihan Band. This could be a quote from the dissertation. I dismissed them peremptorily. There were no differences between Black and white family life that I was prepared to take seriously. There were only resources. Some of those resources communicated by social connection, others communicated through the buying and selling of commodities in the marketplace. But it was only later, in the 80s and 90s that I came to start taking some of that stuff very seriously. But that was my dissertation, essays on the theories of and by the way, the dynamic theory of racial income differences paper is also still cited today, 44 years after I put that dissertation in to Bob Solow at MIT in 1976. I'm pretty proud of that.